Hey folks, welcome back to the Workman's podcast. And today we're going to be taking a look at the Gospel of Mark. If you remember back to last episode when we talked about the Gospel of Matthew, we said instead of telling the story of Jesus 4 different times, we are going to look at Jesus through the lens of each of these authors that we see, each of these gospel accounts. And we talked last time about how Jesus came and how Matthew's account of the gospel really applied to the Jews. It showed how he was the one who was spoken of in prophecy. And as we're going to go through the rest of the gospel accounts, we're going to see the way that each one takes a different view of Jesus or looks at a different portion of him. And today, as we're going to be looking at the Gospel of Mark, we're going to see that Mark's gospel serves the purpose or has the purpose in mind of showing that Jesus is the Messiah. He's going to start off and he's going to show that Jesus is powerful. He's going to show that he is mighty, that he has the abilities and the things that God would have about him, that he is fully God who has came to man. Yet despite the power, yet despite the ability, the might that he has, he didn't come to rule man with an iron fist. He didn't come to be served by man, but rather to serve all of mankind. Mark's purpose is apparent from the very first verse that we see. When we go into the book of Mark and we look at chapter 1 and verse 1, it starts off beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. As Mark starts to write, he makes clear and apparent from the very first line, the very first verse, this is the gospel of Jesus Christ, who is the Son of God. Now, one thing that needs to be noted about Mark's gospel account is that his is the most concise. His moves a little bit quicker than all of the other gospel accounts. It's significantly shorter than all the rest, and it seems as though Mark is moving with an urgency towards the end of the story. He is giving a short, concise account of who Jesus was, bringing us all the way up to the time when Jesus is going to die upon the cross and rise again. As we look to this account, we see that in the beginning of it, Mark skips all of the precursors that we see in the other gospel accounts. In Matthew and Luke, we see the story of Jesus' birth as well as genealogies. In the book of John, we see that he starts off, in the beginning was the Word, and he introduces Christ in such a way. But Mark gives that short introduction as we saw here, and then quickly he moves on to Jesus' ministry. In the first few verses, we go from Jesus being introduced to us to John the Baptist very briefly to Jesus' start in his ministry. And this is what Mark is going to spend most of his time on. He's going to tell us about Jesus. He's going to tell us about his power, about his might. And as we're going to see, he focuses very heavily on the miracles of Christ. Going into chapter 1 is very miracle heavy, showing I think 5 or 6 individual miracles that Jesus performs in his ministry. And he's going to make it very clear to the reader, to the one that would read this gospel account, that Jesus Christ has power. Overall, I believe that in the first 10 chapters, there's something around 20 miracles that are laid out, depending on the way that you were to count them. But 20 or even more than 20 miracles are laid out in the Gospel of Mark. They show Jesus' power over all manner of things, both spiritual and earthly. He goes in and he shows Jesus' power over demons, over disease, over nature, over even the food that the people were eating. When we look at it, he starts off in chapter 1, he talks about Jesus casting out demons. And this isn't the only time that this is brought up. I believe it's twice in chapter 1 as well as in chapter 5, 7, and 9, Jesus is casting out demons. Mark is going to point out many different healings that Jesus is going to do. He's going to talk about how Jesus heals Peter's mother-in-law, how Jesus heals a leper, how he heals the paralytic who is lowered through the roof, and that's just barely touching the surface. He shows that Jesus has power over nature. He calms the storm in chapter 4. He walks on the water. He feeds 5,000 with just a small amount of food. Mark is laying out, and as we're going to look at, and as you read the gospel account of Mark, he is making an argument for Christ. He says, look, Jesus Christ is powerful. Jesus Christ is the Son of God. He is the Messiah. But then we're going to see that there is a transition of a sort. There is a point that Mark is going to emphasize throughout the remainder of his gospel, that even though Jesus has great power, even though he has might over the spiritual, over the physical, over anything that we could look at, Jesus did not come to be served, but he was a servant. In Mark chapter 8, we see that there is this important point in Scripture. And starting in verse 29, we see that Jesus is asking Peter about who he is. Prior to verse 28, he's gone in and he talked about, he asked Peter all of these different questions. Who do men say that I am? But then in verse 29, and he saith to him, but whom say ye that I am? And Peter answers him and says, you are the Christ. And he charged him that he should tell no man. And then we get to verse 31, and he began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer many things, and be rejected of the elders, and of the chief priests and scribes, and be killed, and after 3 days rise again. Notice something with me. Mark has gone through and he has made the reader understand who Jesus was. He's gone through and he's made the reader recognize the power that Jesus has through the miracles that he has performed, through the teachings that he has given. And then he goes to Peter, and Jesus asks Peter, who am I? And Peter says, I know, because we remember Peter followed Jesus. He saw the things that Mark is telling the people about. You are the Christ. And then immediately after this, Jesus teaches them about the things that are going to happen. The Son of Man is going to suffer. The Son of Man is going to face death by the people that should recognize him. Even though he is all powerful, he is a servant. And as Mark continues through, this remains a theme throughout the rest of his gospel account. And we see Jesus' teaching, we see his entry, we see him in the city of Jerusalem. But then we reach the crux of the matter, the importance that Mark is pointing out, the thing that he has been striving to reach, the center point of the entirety of the Bible, where Mark's gospel reaches the death, burial, and resurrection of Christ. It ends with this ultimate sacrifice for all of mankind, where Jesus shows himself as the suffering servant, as the one who loves mankind. And in all of this, we see Mark's ultimate goal. Jesus is powerful, but he is a servant. Jesus is powerful, but he came with an intention to serve mankind. He dies upon a cross, despised by mankind, rejected by those who should have loved him. He faces humiliation. He faces temptation. He faces what it is to be mankind, yet without sin. He goes to the cross and faces an excruciating pain. And in this final few chapters of the Gospel of Mark, we see in perfect display Jesus as a servant, but also Jesus as God. He lays down his life as the ransom for many, but he rises again on the third day to show his power. Mark's ultimate goal is to prove that Jesus is the Son of God. His ultimate goal is to show the reader that this Jesus is the one who has power both in heaven and on earth, but despite all that, he loved mankind enough that he was willing to come and to die. I think there is a passage, a verse that wraps up the entirety of what Mark was trying to show us. In Mark chapter 10 and verse 45. Mark 10 and verse 45 is, I think, our key verse for this, where Jesus says, "For even the Son of Man came not to be ministered unto, but to minister and to give his life a ransom for many." Jesus is teaching them about being a servant. And he says, look, the Son of Man, and Mark has pointed out how much power Jesus had. But he came not to be ministered unto, but to minister. He came to serve, and ultimately, in the perfect show of service, he laid down his life for all of us so that we do not have to face sin. Mark's goal, show the power of Christ, but show that he used that power in order to save all mankind. The Gospel of Mark, again, is this short, concise story laid out so that we can see Jesus in his power, but see the love that he has shown for us. This is what Mark wants us to point out. As you go through, this is a beautiful book. If you want to just get a quick look at Jesus, if you want to quickly overview the things that he did while he was upon this earth, but while also focusing in so tightly on Jesus being God. I hope that you will study more. I hope that this is something that has been beneficial to you, just in a quick, short time to be able to look at who Jesus was as Mark, the author, the writer of this gospel, is able to lay him out before us. Thank you guys so much for listening. I hope you'll join us next time. Thanks.